Good afternoon. Let's try that one more time. Good afternoon. Nice. It is so good to be here with you today. I am the kind of guy that if you know me, I'm a big believer in community before content. And this morning, to start us off moving and dancing and all of that, I thought was brilliant. And to see so many esteemed colleagues that are world-class leaders in the HR space, and the talent management space, and the culture space, getting up and kind of getting their groove on this morning was really fun for me to see. Now, I got email last night. I saw it at about 8 o'clock, and it was from Asif. Asif? How do you pronounce it? Asif? So can we give a round of applause for Asif for just doing a phenomenal job of coordinating all of these moving parts? And in that email, it's a good thing I read it because it said, we have saved a slot for you tomorrow to speak. And that was the first that I had heard of it. Now, if I was a bright speaker, I would have taken out an old presentation and rehashed it, put new dates on it. But not being a very bright guy and always into research and always trying to figure out what the next coolest thing is, I decided, wouldn't it be smart to start from scratch and build a slide deck and do it on the most current research available today? So that I did. It meant very little sleep. I'm from the US, so I'm still trying to figure out what time of day it is. But again, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Again, my name is GUSTAFSON, and my talk is entitled Socially Responsible Leadership 2.0 for such a time as this. For such a time as this in the world. So we'll get to it. Now, Back to the Future was really interesting to see that come up this morning because in many ways, I'm coming back to the future. Socially responsible leadership is a concept that I developed back in 1998. And if I'm doing my math correctly, that's 25 years ago. And so at that point in time, there was not the kind of leadership that I thought was needed to really make the world a better place. In fact, the kind of people that we were holding up as leaders were not necessarily the kind of people that we wanted our kids to emulate as leaders. So I came up with this concept of socially responsible leadership. And the question is it still alive and relevant today? Are there still issues going on in the world? Do we still have autocratic, hierarchical, misogynistic leaders that seem to be in it for their own greed or their own good? I would posit that, yes, you can just look around the world stage, and I think you can pick up on many of them. So, 1998, I embarked upon a doctoral journey. It was a PhD program in organization development. And in that class, or in that program, the very first day, the program director came up and said, if you are not on your third rewrite of your doctoral dissertation, you're already behind. And so I looked around in just total fear, and I asked somebody next to me, what's a doctoral dissertation? He said, Gus, it's a really long paper. I'm like, okay, I think I can write a really long paper. And then the next thing he said was, it's got to be something that you're passionate about. So I looked at the guy next to me and I said, what am I passionate about? And I had just met him 3 minutes earlier, and he said, you're not going to sit by me at all during this program because you're going to irritate me. So I went through this program in every class I took. Global social change, I loved it. Strategic teams, I loved it. Culture, I loved it, every class. But I could not figure out what I was most passionate about. And then one day, my 3-year-old daughter was sitting on my lap in my basement office, and she was looking at all the books on my bookshelf. And she said, Daddy, other than your school books, what are all those books up there? And I said, well, that's about leadership, and that's about leadership, and that's about leadership, and that's about leadership, and then Harry Potter for your brother, leadership, Goodnight Moon for my daughter, leadership. And she said, Dad, do you think maybe you're passionate about leadership? And I literally dropped her off my lap. I'm like, that's it, that's awesome. And so I got really excited. I'm going to study leadership. Now, back in 1998, Nobody in a PhD OD, organization development program, was studying about leadership, right? And so one of the things that's different about getting your doctoral dissertation versus your master's thesis is that in a master's program, you're trying to master what somebody else has said about something. In a doctoral program, you have to create new knowledge. So you've got to find something small enough that nobody else has played in that space. So I thought, well, I'm passionate about leadership. And in 1998, I put leadership in a search engine. I don't even think Google existed back then, but I put leadership in a search engine. How many hits do you think I got? Just throw out some numbers. 2, I hear down there, a little bit more than 2. Any others? Somebody give me a higher number than 2. 10, a little bit higher. 70? 100? You're all really close. 9.8 million hits. 9.8 million hits on the word leadership. And so I thought, that's a little bit broad. Now, I wanted to narrow that down. I thought, what about leadership am I really excited about or am I really passionate about? And what was interesting was at the time I traveled a lot for work, excuse me, and I would be sitting next to people on airplanes, and the books about leadership were always about the business leaders, right? But when I asked them, who are some of the leaders that you most admire, it was never, ever about the business leaders. In fact, the number one all-time answer, and I've continued to do the research for the last 25 years, is Gandhi. Absolute number one, most inspirational, most effective leader of all times, yes. And so I thought, you know, you must be the change you wish to see in the world. That quote's been over and over and over. But for me, that was really something because I landed on this topic of socially responsible leadership. So I put in the words socially responsible leadership in that same search engine that I just got 9.8 million hits for. How many hits do you think I got this time? 2. You were close. There was 3. And none of them had anything to do with the kind of socially responsible leadership I was interested in studying. One was talking about socially transmitted diseases on college campuses where people need to be more responsible and so on. So that to me said, well, there's a need for this. And so we're at our last class, and most of my colleagues, cohort members, had already decided what they were writing their dissertation on. And I stood up that day, and I was so excited, and I'm choking back tears. And I said, I'm going to write my dissertation on socially responsible leadership. Everybody in the class cheered me on, and people are crying and going, Gus, you finally figured out your passion. And the 2 professors up front said, that is the stupidest thing we have ever heard. And I'm just like crushed. And they said, it's just stupid. It's number one, it's not dissertation worthy. Number 2, nobody cares about responsible leadership, right? Now this is pre-Enron, pre-scandals, pre-a lot of stuff. And the more they said, you can't do it, the more determined I got that I was onto something that was really important. So at that point in time, I was living what we call the American dream in America. I was the CEO of a very successful company, had a wonderful wife and kids. We lived in a great community. There wasn't really anything, we weren't rich, but there wasn't anything that we needed or wanted that we couldn't get. And yet, I felt like if you banged on my chest, there was something missing. And what I realized was I was trying to be a wonderful husband, I was trying to be a wonderful father, I was trying to be a wonderful CEO, I was trying to be a wonderful community member, and I was trying to be a wonderful student. And I couldn't do them all simultaneously. So for the first time since I was tall enough to push a lawnmower and had my own business at the age of 12, I resigned from a company. So I was unemployed voluntarily for the first time ever. And that may sound heroic to say, I'm going to quit my job and follow my passion. Well, it's heroic when someone else does it. When it's you and you wake up that Monday morning where you don't go into the office, it's like, oh my goodness, what did I do? And can I call the CEO and get my old job back? But no, it's like this was something I had committed to doing. And so I said, I really want to study socially responsible leadership. Now, anyone recognize any of these three people? This helped spur me on. So in 1998, these were three business leaders that people were writing phenomenal books about, right? Saying these are the leaders to hold up and emulate. The guy on your left, anybody recognize him? Ken Lay, CEO of Enron. I think many of you know how that story ends. So in 1998, he had just been appointed CEO of Enron. Within 2 years, he gutted the organization, laid off 15,000 people, devastated their lives, and ultimately ended up having to pay a fine of $500,000 for fraudulent accounting practices, and he left the world ashamed. But we were holding him up as a great leader because he was arrogant and he was tough as nails, and he would come into organizations and just rip them apart and just damn the consequences. The guy in the middle is Chainsaw Al. The guy's name was Al Dunlap. He was a guy that would go into organizations. Excuse me, did I start with him or did I start with Ken? Ken? So Chainsaw Al was somebody that would go into organizations and again, just tear them apart to get rich himself. So he had just gone into Sunbeam Corporation, and for the first year and a half, he cut everything. Stock market prices went way up, 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 until they found out he was doing fraudulent activity. He, like Ken Lay, had, I think, 10 different federal felony charges attached to him. And finally, the guy on the right is a guy by the name of Krasowski. And he was the head of a company called Tyco. And it was the most admired company at that point in time. And 2 years later, he went to prison. So these were the leaders that we were writing about. And yet, when I asked people who are the leaders that you most admire, these are the three people that came up the most. So I said there's a pretty significant disconnect between the leaders that we're studying or that we're writing about and the leaders that we want our children to emulate, right? Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, always the top three. So leadership got me 9.8 million hits. Socially responsible leadership got me 3 hits. And so what did I discover? Well, the way I went about doing my research was I wanted to go interview people that truly were socially responsible leaders. And the way I defined a socially responsible leader was somebody that had seen some unmet societal need, and then they decided to step in and do something about it. So has anybody heard of Habitat for Humanity? Most everyone in the room has. Millard Fuller was the founder of Habitat for Humanity. He was going along life one day, saw somebody in substandard housing, and said, I can no longer live in the world where people are living in ways where they could have roofs over their heads. So I made a list of 22 founders of not-for-profit organizations, and I went around and sat at their feet and listened to stories. And they didn't do it to get rich. They didn't do it to get famous. They did it because it was the right thing to do for society. And then I created my own theory of socially responsible leadership based on these leaders that I thought were phenomenal, phenomenal examples. And one of the things I learned along the way is this is the most underutilized leadership muscle in our body. 98% of all leadership development courses that you go to are unapologetically focusing on the head. This is the muscle that we need to engage the most. And when we think about leaders that are vulnerable and authentic, think about Dr. RL this morning, the way he started the conference and shared, completely making himself vulnerable. Those are the kind of leaders we want today. So the reason I say leadership comes from the heart is it defines who you are. It's where our dreams originate. It defines what we believe. It determines which direction we lead. It's where our deepest passions reside. It's where vision is ignited, where spiritual communication occurs, whatever that means to you. And finally, it's where character comes from. And if you've seen the iceberg metaphor, the little bit on top is the leader charisma the leadership personality, all the stuff underneath, that is the leadership character. And so what I love is, with this notion of heart being the most important leadership muscle in our body, Mother Teresa said, give of your hands to serve and your hearts to love. Doesn't have to be any more difficult than that, right? We've got hands. If you've got hands at work, go do something and give your hearts to love. So here's what I learned. And these were the, I guess I would call them early leadership competencies of socially responsible leaders. They all had servants' hearts, right? They're all there to make the world a better place. They're all extraordinarily humble, authentic, vulnerable. They created unconditional trust within their organizations. Their people would do anything for them. They were amazing storytellers. They could look over their lives' experiences and be able to say how this was a teachable moment, and this was a teachable moment, and this was a teachable moment, and this is how I got from here to there in my evolution. All of them were about just do it. You know, walk the talk. We can say all day long, here are our core values, but if we're not living them out on a daily basis, or if we violate them behaviorally, they're out the window. They all brought this incredible passion and this unlimited energy. So when you figure out what your purpose is and you get your core values aligned with your purpose, literally unlimited energy comes from that. Now, there's nothing soft about these leaders. They had an unwavering resolve on the vision of the organization, of whatever it was, helping some marginalized group of people, and they had tremendous courage to do whatever it took to make that vision a reality. They created flourishing organizations, and we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in 1998. The world's just starting to catch up with DEI and ESG initiatives. Excuse me. And they told me it's all about purpose, it's all about purpose, it's all about purpose. And it's the values that set us straight as far as our purpose goes. What is the number one most sought after company that young people want to go work for? It's the companies that have a purpose that's greater than themselves and values that are aligned with themselves. And they also knew at that point in time that organizational culture trumped everything. So they were talking about culture long before CEOs were talking about culture. Now there's the father of modern management, Peter Drucker, was a pretty smart guy. And he said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. These folks weren't reading about leadership. They weren't reading about culture. They weren't reading about organizational effectiveness. They were just rolling up their sleeves out there doing it. So juxtaposition that with 2023. So juxtaposition that with the year 2023, and you think about all of the things that are going on in the world, and I would argue that there's as much of a need today as there ever was for socially responsible leadership. In fact, February is such a cool month because all these different global trend studies come out. The things that keep CEOs up at night more than anything else: attracting and retaining top talent, developing the next generation of leader, and managing an engaged workforce. It's all about the people. Now, trust in leadership has gone way, way downhill. And when you look at the words in the lower left-hand side of the screen, this is a word cloud of all of the different attributes, traits, characteristics that we want in our leaders. And number one is empathy. And I bet you can all think of a world leader that probably lacked the empathy gene, and maybe multiple ones. So the kind of things that they're asking for, that employees say, this is the kind of organization I want to be part of, that's exactly what we were talking about with socially responsible leadership 25 years ago. So Shine said leaders create cultures, cultures create the next generation of leaders. So we as leaders have a choice at this point in time. I won't go into how mission ties to vision, ties to values, ties to culture, ties to leadership capabilities. I've got many slides that do that. What I will offer up to you for anybody that is interested in seeing how you actually operationalize this, put it into practice. I've been doing it for 25 years in organizations, big, small, for-profit, not-for-profit, governmental, educational, and literally 6 continents across the globe. And there's something like 250,000 leaders that have been individually transformed based on following the principles and the tenets of socially responsible leadership. And what's really cool is in 1998, I coined the phrase. About 10 years later, the university that mocked me called me up and said, hey, Gus, we want you to start a program, and we called it Values-Driven Leadership, Center for Values-Driven Leadership. 5 years later at the University of Pretoria, they started the Center for Responsible Leadership. And if you do a Google search today, socially responsible leadership has about 50 million hits, values-driven leadership has about 100 million hits, and responsible leadership has about 200 million hits. It is the highest, most sought-after term on the planet. So I am going to leave you with a quote. Whoops. Martin Luther King had so many beautiful quotes, but I love this one. Everyone can be great because anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and verb agree to serve. You only need a heart full of grace and a soul generated by love. And so when I look out into this room, I see hearts filled with grace, and I see souls generated by love. And so I encourage all of you to go forth, live what Gandhi said, be the change, and change the world. Thank you very much. There's my contact info. If you want any information, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I'll share it all with you.